My name is Nettie, and I am 54 years old. 3 years ago, my son Jake cut me completely out of his life. Last Tuesday, my phone rang for the first time in all those silent months. It was him. But here's the thing that breaks my heart. He wasn't calling because he missed me or because he finally understood the pain I went through. He was calling because word had spread around our small Cleveland neighborhood that his mother had just won $2.7 million in the state lottery. As I held that winning ticket in my trembling hands and listened to his voice pretending to care, I realized something profound about love money and the choices that define us. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe because what I'm about to share will challenge everything you think you know about family loyalty when money enters the picture. Let me take you back to when Jake was 15 and our family was whole. Those were the golden years before tragedy knocked on our door and changed everything forever. My husband Robert worked as an auto mechanic at Davidson's Garage on the east side of Cleveland, and I spent my days as a medical secretary at the community clinic. We weren't rich by any stretch, but we had something more valuable than money. We had each other. Our little wooden house on Maple Street had 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen that always smelled like fresh coffee, and a backyard where Robert taught Jake how to throw a perfect curveball. Every evening after dinner, we'd sit on the front porch swing that Robert built with his own hands, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes until the streetlights flickered on. Those summer evenings felt endless, filled with the sound of Jake's laughter as he chased fireflies with a mason jar. Jake was everything a mother could hope for in a son. Sure, he was a bit shy and preferred books to sports most days, but he had this incredible mind for numbers. His math teacher, Mrs. Henderson, told us during parent conferences that Jake was the brightest student she'd had in 20 years. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, just like his grandfather on Robert's side. Every night, he'd spread his homework across the dining room table, and I'd bring him hot chocolate while he worked through complex algebra problems that made my head spin. Robert and I started saving for Jake's college education when he turned 13. We opened a special account and put away $50 every month, sometimes more, when Robert picked up overtime shifts. I took on evening work cleaning offices downtown, walking through empty buildings with my mop and bucket, thinking about Jake's bright future with every step. We calculated that by the time he graduated high school, we'd have enough to cover at least his first 2 years at Ohio State. The 3 of us had this tradition every summer where we'd pack up our old blue pickup truck and drive to Lake Erie for a long weekend. Robert would set up our tent while Jake and I gathered firewood, and we'd spend hours fishing off the pier, telling stories and roasting marshmallows over the campfire. Jake always caught the biggest fish, though I suspect Robert had something to do with that. Those trips were our escape from the everyday worries of bills and work, a time when we could just be a family without any outside pressures. But by the time Jake turned 17, something started shifting in our perfect little world. Robert began coming home from the garage more exhausted than usual. At first he brushed it off as getting older, joking that 45 was catching up with him. But then came the persistent cough that wouldn't go away no matter how many bottles of cough syrup I bought. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, and I'd find him sitting on the edge of our bed trying to catch his breath. I begged him to see Dr. Martinez at the clinic where I worked, but Robert was stubborn as a mule when it came to doctors. He'd grown up in a family where you worked through pain and never complained. It took weeks of nagging and a particularly bad coughing fit at Jake's baseball game before he finally agreed to make an appointment. I remember sitting in that sterile waiting room holding Robert's calloused hand and telling myself that everything would be fine. We'd get some antibiotics, maybe an inhaler, and life would go back to normal. Dr. Martinez ordered chest x-rays and blood work standard procedure for a cough that persistent. When the results came back, he called us into his office with an expression I'd seen too many times working at the clinic. It's the look medical professionals get when they're about to deliver news that will shatter someone's world. The x-rays showed masses in both of Robert's lungs. Stage 4, lung cancer, aggressive and already spreading. 6 months, maybe 9 if we were lucky and the treatment worked. That night, Robert and I sat Jake down in our living room and tried to explain what was happening. I watched my 17-year-old son's face crumble as the reality sank in. His father, his hero, the man who taught him everything from changing a tire to standing up for what's right, was dying. Jake didn't cry that night. Instead, he just nodded quietly and walked to his room, closing the door behind him. That was the beginning of the wall he'd build between us, brick by emotional brick. The next 18 months became a blur of hospital visits, insurance battles, and medical bills that arrived like clockwork every few weeks. Robert's treatment plan included aggressive chemotherapy radiation and experimental drugs that cost more than our annual income. Our insurance covered some of it, but the copays and uncovered medications created a mountain of debt that grew taller every month. I sold my car first, taking the bus to work and borrowing rides from coworkers when I needed to get Robert to his appointments. Then we took out a second mortgage on the house, using every penny to pay for treatments that might give us a few more precious months together. I picked up a second job cleaning office buildings at night, dragging myself through empty corporate hallways from 9 p.m. until 2 a.m., then catching a few hours of sleep before starting my day shift at the clinic. Robert fought like a warrior, never complaining, even when the chemo made him so sick he couldn't keep water down. But his body was betraying him, growing weaker despite our desperate efforts to save him. He lost 60 pounds. His thick brown hair fell out in clumps, and his hands that once fixed any broken engine now shook when he tried to lift a coffee cup. The man I'd fallen in love with 22 years ago was disappearing before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Jake's reaction to his father's illness broke my heart in a completely different way. Instead of drawing closer to us during this crisis, he began pulling away, staying out later and later with friends I'd never met. He started missing his part-time job at the grocery store, coming home with alcohol on his breath and anger in his eyes. When I tried to talk to him about what was happening with his dad, he'd snap at me or walk away. The worst part was how Jake began blaming me for our situation. During one particularly heated argument, he screamed that I should have made his father go to the doctor sooner, that I should have bought better insurance, that everything falling apart was somehow my fault. His words cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. Here I was working 3 jobs and sacrificing everything to save his father, and my own son was treating me like the enemy. School became another battleground. Jake's grades dropped from A's and B's to C's and D's. Mrs. Henderson called multiple times about his absences and his attitude in class. The boy who once dreamed of engineering was barely graduating high school. When I tried to discuss his future, Jake would laugh bitterly and ask what future he could possibly have with a dead father and a broke family. Robert passed away on a cold February morning just shy of his 46th birthday. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, and Jake was nowhere to be found. He'd gone out the night before and didn't answer his phone when I called frantically from the hospital. He finally showed up at home 3 hours after his father died, hungover and reeking of cheap beer. When I told him what had happened, he just stared at me blankly, nodded once, and went to his room. The funeral costs nearly broke us completely. Even with the most basic service we owed the funeral home $4,000 we didn't have. Robert's life insurance policy had a clause that reduced the payout for cancer patients, leaving us with barely enough to cover the outstanding medical bills. I borrowed money from my sister in Toledo, took a cash advance on our last remaining credit card, and sold Robert's tools to make ends meet. Standing at Robert's graveside on that gray February afternoon, surrounded by his coworkers and a handful of family members, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Jake stood beside me in his ill-fitting black suit, dry-eyed and distant-looking, like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. When the service ended and people began leaving, he walked away without saying a word, leaving me standing alone next to the man who had been my everything for over 2 decades. The months following Robert's death were the darkest of my life, but they were just the beginning of Jake's downward spiral. Without his father's steady presence, my 18-year-old son seemed to lose any sense of direction or purpose. He graduated high school by the skin of his teeth and immediately announced that college was off the table. Our carefully saved education fund had been drained for medical expenses anyway, so higher education became just another broken dream in our shattered family. Jake found work at a local warehouse loading trucks and moving inventory for minimum wage. The job should have been a stepping stone, a way to earn money while figuring out his next move. Instead, it became an excuse to surround himself with older men who introduced him to harder drinking and gambling. He started coming home with stories about poker games and back rooms and sure fire betting tips on basketball games. I watched helplessly as my son followed the same destructive path that had claimed several men in our neighborhood. His new friends, Marcus and Tyler, were both in their mid-20s with criminal records and substance abuse problems. They treated Jake like their personal ATM, always ready with get-rich-quick schemes that required just a little investment money. Marcus sold Jake on the idea of buying a used car to flip for profit, taking $300 of Jake's first paycheck and disappearing for 2 weeks. Tyler convinced him that a particular racehorse was guaranteed to win, resulting in Jake losing his entire second paycheck at the track. Despite these obvious red flags, Jake defended his friends whenever I tried to voice my concerns. He accused me of being paranoid and controlling, claiming that I didn't want him to have any happiness after everything we'd been through. When I pointed out that his new lifestyle was costing him money he couldn't afford to lose, he'd argue that I didn't understand how investments worked, that I was too scared to take the risks necessary to get ahead in life. The requests for money started small and seemed reasonable. Jake needed $40 for work boots, $60 for his car registration, $80 to help a friend who'd been laid off. I gave him what I could from my tight budget, believing that helping my son get back on his feet was worth the sacrifice. I was working 2 jobs now, pulling double shifts at the clinic and cleaning offices on weekends, trying to dig us out of the debt hole that Robert's illness had created. But Jake's requests grew larger and more frequent. He needed $200 to cover his car insurance after missing a payment, then $300 to pay his share of rent for an apartment he was supposedly sharing with Marcus. Each time he had a perfectly logical explanation and a promise to pay me back as soon as his next paycheck came in. The payback never materialized, and I began to realize that my son was developing serious problems with money management. The breaking point came when I discovered that several valuable items had disappeared from our house. Robert's antique pocket watch, the one his grandfather had given him, vanished from our bedroom dresser. My grandmother's silver bracelet disappeared from my jewelry box. When I confronted Jake about the missing items, he flew into a rage, accusing me of not trusting him and demanding to know if I thought he was some kind of thief. But the evidence kept mounting. Tools from Robert's garage went missing one by one. My good winter coat disappeared from the front closet. Even small electronics like our old radio and the DVD player vanished without explanation. Each time I brought up these disappearances, Jake had elaborate theories about break-ins or misplaced items, anything to deflect blame from himself. The final straw came on a Thursday evening in November. I had exactly $812 left in our checking account, money I'd been saving to pay our electric bill before the power company shut us off. When I checked the account online that evening, it showed a balance of $12. Someone had written a check for $800, forging my signature with remarkable accuracy. When I confronted Jake with the bank statement, he finally broke down and admitted what he'd done. But instead of showing remorse, he became defensive and angry, claiming that he'd had no choice because he owed money to people who would hurt him if he didn't pay. He insisted that he'd fully intended to replace the money before I noticed that his plan had been foolproof until a sure-thing bet fell through. Standing in our kitchen looking at my 20-year-old son who had just stolen our last hope of keeping the lights on, I realized that the boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. The conversation that ended our relationship happened on a cold Sunday morning in December. I had spent the previous night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide what to do about Jake's escalating behavior. The stolen money, the missing items, the lies, and the complete lack of accountability had pushed me past my breaking point. I knew that continuing to enable his self-destructive choices would only make things worse. But the thought of losing my only remaining family member felt like preparing for my own death. I found Jake in the kitchen that morning, nursing a hangover and scrolling through his phone with bloodshot eyes. He looked terrible, pale, and thin from months of poor eating and heavy drinking. When I sat down across from him at our old wooden table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, I could see in his expression that he knew this conversation was coming. I started by telling him how much I loved him, how proud Robert would have been of the man Jake was supposed to become. I reminded him of his dreams of engineering, of the bright future we'd all planned together before cancer destroyed our family. But then, I had to be honest about what I was seeing, a young man who was destroying himself and taking me down with him in the process. The ultimatum was the hardest thing I'd ever had to say to another human being. Jake had 2 choices. He could check himself into a rehabilitation program and commit to getting clean, or he needed to find somewhere else to live. I couldn't continue watching him steal from me, lie to me, and waste his potential on gambling and alcohol. I'd already lost my husband. I couldn't afford to lose myself trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. Jake's reaction was explosive and heartbreaking. He jumped up from the table, knocking over his coffee cup and sending dark liquid spreading across the wood surface. He screamed that I was abandoning him, just like everyone else in his life had abandoned him. How could I choose money over my own son? How could I be so cold and calculating when he was obviously struggling with grief over his father's death? But what hurt most was his accusation that I'd never really loved him, that I was just looking for an excuse to get rid of the burden he'd become. He claimed that I blamed him for the financial problems, that I resented having to support him when I could barely support myself. According to Jake, I was using his mistakes as justification for throwing him away like garbage. I tried to explain that this ultimatum came from love, not rejection. I told him that sometimes loving someone means setting boundaries even when those boundaries are painful for everyone involved. I reminded him that addiction was a disease, not a moral failing, and that getting help was a sign of strength, not weakness. But Jake wasn't interested in hearing anything I had to say. He stormed upstairs to his room and began throwing his belongings into garbage bags and cardboard boxes. I could hear him slamming drawers and cursing under his breath as he packed. When I knocked on his door and tried to continue our conversation, he told me to leave him alone, that he was done listening to my lectures and conditions. He'd find people who actually cared about him, people who wouldn't give up on him the first time things got difficult. 3 hours later, Jake carried his bags downstairs and headed for the front door. I followed behind him, tears streaming down my face, begging him to reconsider. I told him that he would always have a home with me, that all he had to do was get help and everything could go back to the way it used to be. I promised that we could work together to honor Robert's memory and build the future he'd wanted for our family. Jake paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and for a moment I thought he might change his mind. He turned back to look at me, and I saw a flicker of the sweet boy I'd raised, the child who used to bring me dandelions and tell me I was the best mom in the world. But then his expression hardened again, and he said something that still echoes in my mind 3 years later. "You chose money over family, Mom. I hope it keeps you warm at night." The sound of his car starting up and driving away was like a death sentence. I stood at the front window watching his taillights disappear around the corner, knowing that I might never see him again. The silence that filled the house was deafening, broken only by my own sobs as I realized that I was now completely alone in the world. For the next 3 years, I tried everything I could think of to reestablish contact with Jake. I called his cell phone until he changed the number. I sent letters to every address I could find for him until they started coming back marked "Return to Sender." I even hired a private investigator who confirmed that Jake was living in Detroit, working at an automotive plant, but he refused to pass along any messages from me. Through mutual friends, I learned bits and pieces about his life. He'd found an apartment in a rough part of the city and was making decent money on the assembly line. Some people said he'd cleaned up his act and stopped gambling, while others whispered that he'd just gotten better at hiding his problems. Either way, he wanted nothing to do with the mother who had given him an ultimatum and stuck to it. Friday, March 15th, started like any other day in my quiet, lonely routine. I woke up at 6 a.m., made coffee for one, and prepared for my shift at the clinic where I now worked as the office manager. Dr. Martinez had promoted me after seeing how efficiently I handled the chaos of insurance claims and patient scheduling. The job paid better than my old position, but it could never fill the emptiness that Jake's absence had created in my life. After work, I stopped at Murphy's Corner Store like I did every Friday, picking up groceries for the week, and out of habit, more than hope, a lottery ticket. I'd been playing the same numbers for almost 2 years, 7, 14, 21, 35, and 42, with 18 as the Powerball. These weren't random numbers. They represented the birthdays of the 2 most important people in my life. 7 and 14 were Robert's birth date, 21 and 35 were Jake's, and 42 was my own. The 18 was for the date Jake was born, March 18th. I never really expected to win anything significant. The most I'd ever gotten was $20 here and there, which I usually spent on another ticket the following week. For me, playing the lottery was less about getting rich and more about holding on to hope that something good might still happen in my life. It was a small act of faith that the universe might have better plans for me than growing old alone in a house full of memories. Saturday evening, I settled into Robert's old recliner with a cup of tea and turned on the television to watch the lottery drawing. It was part of my weekend routine, a few minutes of harmless fantasy before settling in with a book or a movie. The announcer began calling out the winning numbers, and I half-heartedly checked my ticket, not really paying attention until I realized that the first number 7 matched mine. Then came 14, and I sat up a little straighter. When 21 was called, my heart started beating faster. 35 sent a jolt of electricity through my body. By the time 42 was announced, I was standing up holding the ticket with shaking hands, afraid to believe what was happening. When the Powerball 18 was revealed, I dropped the ticket and had to scramble to pick it up from the floor. I checked the numbers again and again, certain that I was making some kind of mistake. But there they were, all 6 numbers matching exactly. According to the television screen, the jackpot was $4.2 million, which meant roughly $2.7 million after taxes. I had just become a multimillionaire. The next few hours passed in a surreal haze. I called the lottery office to confirm that my ticket was legitimate, listening to the official congratulations while sitting in my kitchen where Jake and I had shared so many meals. I thought about Robert and wondered if he somehow had a hand in this incredible twist of fate. Most of all, I thought about Jake and imagined his face when he found out that his stubborn, penny-pinching mother had hit the jackpot. But I decided not to tell anyone right away. Something made me want to keep this news private while I figured out what it meant for my future. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was just caution born from years of disappointment, but I sensed that money this significant would change everything about my life, including relationships I thought were over forever. Tuesday evening. Exactly 4 days after I'd confirmed my lottery win, the phone rang at 7 o'clock. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, but something compelled me to pick up. The voice on the other end was older and deeper than I remembered, but unmistakably familiar. Mom. Jake's voice was soft, uncertain, like he wasn't sure I'd even speak to him. It's Jake. I was hoping we could talk. My heart felt like it might explode right there in my chest. After 3 years of silence, 3 years of wondering if my only child was alive and healthy here, he was on the phone reaching out to me. I gripped the receiver so tightly, my knuckles went white, afraid that if I loosened my hold even slightly, this moment would disappear like a dream. Jake, I whispered, my voice breaking on his name. Oh, honey, I've missed you so much. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly. Mom, I heard some news about you, about the lottery. Is it true? And there it was, not, I missed you too, or I'm sorry for everything that happened. The first real thing he wanted to discuss was money. My heart sank even as I tried to maintain hope that maybe, just maybe, this call was about more than my sudden financial windfall. How did you hear about that? I asked, though I knew that news traveled fast in our old neighborhood. Billy Thompson saw it in the paper and called to tell me, Mom, that's incredible. $2.7 million. You must be over the moon. I was quiet for a moment, processing the complicated emotions swirling through me. Joy at hearing his voice, sadness that money had prompted his call, hope that maybe this could be a new beginning for us, and fear that I was about to have my heart broken all over again. Jake, I want to see you, I said finally. We have a lot to talk about. We arranged to meet the following Saturday at Sunrise Cafe, a small coffee shop in downtown Cleveland that had opened after Jake moved away. I chose it deliberately because it held no memories for either of us, neutral ground where we could start fresh without the weight of our shared history pressing down on every word. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a corner table where I could watch the door. When Jake walked in at exactly 2 o'clock, I barely recognized him. The thin, angry 20-year-old who had left my house had been replaced by a 23-year-old man with broader shoulders and more confident bearing. He'd grown a neatly trimmed beard and was wearing clothes that looked expensive, dark jeans and a leather jacket that must have cost several $100s. But it wasn't just Jake who walked through that door. Behind him was a young woman I'd never seen before, petite and blonde with carefully applied makeup and designer handbag. She clung to his arm possessively and surveyed the coffee shop like she was evaluating its worth. When Jake spotted me, he waved with what seemed like genuine warmth, but something about the whole scene felt rehearsed. "Mom, you look great," Jake said as he approached, leaning down to give me an awkward hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "I want you to meet Amanda. We've been together for about 8 months now." Amanda extended a manicured hand and smiled with perfectly white teeth that had clearly received professional attention. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you, Mrs. Patterson. Jake has told me so much about you, especially lately." The "especially lately" comment sent a chill down my spine, but I forced myself to smile and shake her hand. We ordered our drinks, and I waited for Jake to explain why he was here, why now, why after 3 years of complete silence. "Mom, I want to start by saying that I've grown up a lot since I left home." Jake began stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate precision. "I've learned some hard lessons about responsibility and priorities. I realize now that we both said things during that last fight that we didn't really mean." I noticed that he didn't actually apologize for anything specific, just acknowledged that regrettable things had been said. There was no mention of the stolen money, the missing items, or the pain his addiction had caused both of us. Instead, he seemed to be rewriting our history as a simple misunderstanding between two people under stress. Amanda jumped into the conversation with enthusiasm that felt forced. "Jake's told me all about your family's challenges during his father's illness. It must have been so overwhelming trying to handle everything on your own. I can understand why tempers flared during such a difficult time." The way she phrased it made me sound like an unreasonable woman who had overreacted to normal grief behavior. I could see the narrative they'd constructed together. Poor Jake struggling with his father's death, driven away by a mother who couldn't handle his emotional needs during a crisis. It was a story that painted me as the villain, and him as the victim. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately." Jake continued, his voice taking on a wistful tone that I remembered from his childhood. "About how proud he'd be to see us back together rebuilding our relationship. He always said that family was the most important thing, that we should never let anything come between us." Using Robert's memory to manipulate me was a low blow that made my stomach turn. Jake knew exactly how much I'd loved his father, how desperately I missed him every single day. Invoking Robert's name in service of whatever agenda had brought him here felt like desecrating something sacred. Then, the conversation took the turn I'd been dreading. "Amanda's actually been helping me think about the future," Jake said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "We've been talking about starting a business together, something that would honor Dad's memory. Maybe a custom auto shop, the kind of place Dad always dreamed about opening." Amanda nodded enthusiastically. "There's such a market for quality restoration work, especially for classic cars. Jake has his father's mechanical gifts, and I have a business degree. We'd make a perfect team. The only thing we're missing is startup capital." And there it was, not even an hour into our reunion, and they were already pitching me for money. They wanted to use my lottery winnings to fund their business venture, wrapping their request in sentimental references to Robert and family reconciliation. "We've done all the research," Amanda continued, pulling out a folder that looked suspiciously well prepared. "Initial investment of around $500,000 would cover everything lease on a building, equipment, insurance, marketing, everything we'd need to get started. With your resources and our dedication, we could build something really special." I sat there listening to their presentation, watching Jake's animated gestures and Amanda's calculating smiles, and felt my heart breaking all over again. This wasn't about missing me or wanting to rebuild our relationship. This was about money, pure and simple. They'd heard about my lottery win and saw an opportunity to cash in on guilt and maternal love. "That sounds like quite an ambitious project," I said carefully. "Give me some time to think it over." Jake's face lit up with what looked like genuine happiness, but Amanda's expression flickered with something that might have been impatience. "Of course, Mom. We understand this is a big decision, but I really think this could be a new beginning for all of us." As we said our goodbyes in the parking lot, Jake hugged me again, this time with a little more warmth. "I've missed you, Mom. I really have. I know we can make this work." Driving home, I wanted desperately to believe that Jake's feelings were genuine, that somewhere underneath the business proposal and Amanda's influence was the son I'd raised and loved. But something felt wrong about the entire encounter, something beyond just asking for money. There was a practiced quality to their presentation, a sense that I'd just been pitched by professional salespeople rather than reunited with family. Despite my growing suspicions about Jake's motives, I couldn't shake the hope that maybe this really could be our second chance. For 3 years, I'd dreamed about him coming home, about us finding a way to heal the wounds that had torn our family apart. Now that he was reaching out, I felt obligated to give him the benefit of the doubt, even if doubt was exactly what I was feeling. But I'm not the same naive woman I was before Robert died and Jake left. Loss has a way of teaching hard lessons about human nature, and money has a way of revealing people's true priorities. Instead of immediately agreeing to fund their business venture, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a former Cleveland police detective who specialized in background checks and financial investigations. It cost me $800 money I could afford now, but would have been a luxury before my lottery win. I asked him to look into Jake's life in Detroit, his relationship with Amanda, and anything else that might help me understand what I was really dealing with. The report that came back 2 weeks later shattered what remained of my maternal illusions. Jake had not cleaned up his life as thoroughly as he'd claimed. While he was indeed working at the automotive plant and earning decent money, he was also deeply involved with underground gambling operations throughout the Detroit area. According to Marcus's sources, Jake owed approximately $80,000 to various bookmakers and loan sharks, people who don't accept late payments or excuses. Amanda's background was equally troubling. She wasn't just Jake's girlfriend. She was a regular at several Detroit area casinos and had been arrested twice for credit card fraud, though charges were dropped both times due to technicalities. She'd met Jake at a poker game 6 months earlier and had been encouraging his gambling habits while positioning herself as his financial advisor. The custom auto shop they'd pitched to me was indeed a real business plan, but not the kind of legitimate operation they'd described. According to Marcus's investigation, their real intention was to use the shop as a front for money laundering operations connected to the same gambling network where Jake had accumulated his debts. My lottery money would essentially be used to pay off his obligations while setting up an illegal operation that could land all of us in federal prison. Most heartbreaking of all was the discovery that Jake had been telling people around Detroit about his rich mother for weeks before he called me. He'd bragged in bars and at card games about how he was going to solve all his problems with one conversation, how blood was thicker than water and his mom would never turn him down when he needed help. Reading that report in my living room surrounded by pictures of the sweet boy Jake used to be, I felt something inside me die. This wasn't grief or disappointment. This was the death of hope itself. The son I'd been mourning for 3 years was truly gone, replaced by someone who saw me only as a solution to his financial problems. But along with the sadness came something unexpected clarity. For the first time since Robert died, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I called Jake and asked him to meet me again, this time without Amanda. I told him I'd made a decision about his business proposal and wanted to discuss it privately. We met at the same coffee shop on a Thursday evening. Jake arrived looking confident and relaxed, probably expecting to walk away with a check that would solve all his problems. He ordered an expensive drink and settled back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone who believed he'd successfully manipulated the situation. "I've been thinking a lot about your proposal." I began, keeping my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside me. "And I've done some research into both the auto restoration business and your current situation in Detroit." Jake's expression shifted slightly, but he maintained his confident smile. "That's great, Mom. I knew once you looked into it you'd see what a solid opportunity this is. I also know about the $80,000 you owe to various gambling organizations." I continued, watching his face drain of color. "I know about Amanda's criminal background and her connections to money laundering operations. I know that you've been telling people around Detroit that your rich mother is going to bail you out of all your problems." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stared at me with an expression that cycled through shock, anger, and something that might have been shame. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and dangerous. "You had me investigated. You hired someone to spy on your own son." "I hired someone to learn the truth," I replied. "Something you've never been willing to give me voluntarily." Jake's facade crumbled completely, then revealing the angry, desperate man underneath. He accused me of being paranoid and controlling, of never giving him a chance to prove himself. When that didn't work, he tried manipulation, claiming that he'd only gotten involved with dangerous people because he was struggling with grief and had no family support. Finally, he resorted to threats, suggesting that the people he owed money to wouldn't be understanding if he couldn't pay them back. "You're my mother," he said, his voice rising. "You're supposed to help me when I'm in trouble, not judge me and abandon me." "I did help you when you were in trouble," I replied, surprised by how calm I felt. "I gave you a choice between getting help for your addiction and continuing down a destructive path. You chose the path. Now you want me to help you avoid the consequences of that choice." Standing up from the table, I looked at this man who shared Robert's eyes and my stubborn chin, and I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete emotional detachment from my only child. "The son I raised died 3 years ago," I told him. "I don't know who you are now, but you're not my responsibility anymore." Jake called after me as I walked toward the door, his voice breaking with what might have been real emotion for the first time in our conversation. But I didn't turn around. Some bridges can only be burned once, and this one had been smoldering for years. Walking away from Jake that evening was the hardest and most liberating thing I'd ever done in my life. For years, I'd carried the guilt of our estrangement, wondering if I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too quick to choose principles over family. But seeing him try to manipulate me with lies and threats confirmed that I'd made the right decision 3 years ago, and I was making the right decision now. The next few months brought a parade of attempts at contact. Jake called repeatedly, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. He sent letters filled with accusations and emotional manipulation. Amanda even showed up at my house once, demanding to speak with me about Jake's inheritance, as if my lottery winnings somehow belonged to him by birthright. I had my locks changed and my phone number switched to an unlisted line. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that Jake's situation in Detroit had deteriorated rapidly after our final meeting. Unable to pay his debts, he'd been forced to leave town and find work in Chicago. Amanda had moved on to a new target, someone else with money and questionable judgment. The auto shop plan had evaporated along with any pretense of legitimate business ventures, and I knew exactly how I wanted to invest them. Robert's battle with cancer had shown me how financial stress could compound medical trauma, how families could be destroyed not just by disease, but by the crushing debt that came with fighting it. If I couldn't save my own family, maybe I could help other families avoid the same fate. I used a significant portion of my lottery winnings to establish the Robert Patterson Memorial Fund, a nonprofit organization that provides financial assistance to families dealing with catastrophic medical expenses. We pay for things that insurance doesn't cover: experimental treatments, travel costs for specialized care, living expenses during extended treatment periods, and the kind of everyday bills that pile up when someone can't work because they're fighting for their life. The work has brought me more satisfaction than any amount of money ever could. I've met families who remind me of what Robert, Jake, and I used to be, people who love each other fiercely and will sacrifice anything to stay together. I've helped children continue their education while their parents battle cancer. I've kept families in their homes during medical crises that would otherwise have left them homeless. Starting the foundation also introduced me to an entire community of people who understand loss and resilience in ways that most people never have to learn. Other widows who've rebuilt their lives from scratch, adult children who've watched their parents face terminal illness with dignity and grace, medical professionals who see the human cost of our healthcare system every single day and work tirelessly to minimize that damage. Dr. Martinez, who had delivered Robert's diagnosis all those years ago, became one of my closest advisors in setting up the foundation. He helped me understand which interventions would have the greatest impact and connected me with other organizations doing similar work. Through him, I met Sarah Chen, a social worker who had lost her own husband to leukemia and was starting a support group for medical widows. 6 months after cutting ties with Jake permanently, I received one final letter from him. It was different from his previous communications, shorter and less manipulative. He wrote that he'd finally entered a rehabilitation program in Chicago and was working to address his gambling addiction. He said he understood why I'd made the choices I had and didn't expect forgiveness or financial help. He just wanted me to know that he was trying to become someone Robert would have been proud of. I don't know if Jake's letter was genuine or just another attempt at manipulation. Frankly, I don't need to know. I've learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their behavior or enabling their self-destruction. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step away and let people face the consequences of their choices. Today, almost 2 years after winning the lottery and 18 months after walking away from Jake forever, I wake up every morning with a sense of purpose I never had during my years of struggle. My house on Maple Street is no longer filled with the sounds of family life, but it's also no longer filled with the tension and heartbreak that defined those final years with Jake. I still miss Robert every single day. I still grieve for the son Jake could have become if addiction and grief hadn't twisted him into someone I didn't recognize. But I've learned that grief doesn't have to define your entire life. That loss can teach you as much about living as love ever did. The lottery money that seemed like such a blessing when I first won it turned out to be something much more valuable than financial security. It became a test of character both for Jake and for me. It revealed who he really was underneath his protestations of love and family loyalty, and it allowed me to discover who I could become when I stopped letting other people's problems control my life. Sometimes people ask me if I regret giving up on my only child, if I worry about growing old alone without family nearby. The answer is complicated because there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I'm surrounded by people whose lives I've been able to touch through the foundation people who understand that family isn't always about blood, but sometimes about choosing who deserves your love and trust. And here's the truth that took me 57 years to understand: the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money or endless chances to disappoint you. Sometimes the greatest gift is refusing to participate in their destruction, even when that refusal breaks your own heart in the process. Money, as it turns out, really can't buy love or loyalty or second chances, but it can buy something much more valuable than any of those things. It can buy you the freedom to choose who you become after everything you thought you knew about your life falls apart. And that freedom, hard-earned and carefully protected, is worth more than any lottery jackpot ever could be. Have you ever had to make a choice between helping someone you love and protecting yourself from their destructive behavior? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about love loss and the lessons that change us forever. Share this with someone who might need to hear that sometimes letting go is the most loving thing you can do. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth isn't determined by how much others are willing to take from you, but by how much you're willing to give to those who truly deserve it. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people who genuinely care about you in return.